This program contains coarse language.
Free edition of Q&A for the Sydney Writers' Festival. I'm Tony Jones, here to answer your questions. Best-selling British philosopher Julian Baggini. Award-winning poet, musician and novelist Kate Tempest, who delivers the opening address for the Sydney Writers' Festival tomorrow. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, whose latest book, Heretic, argues for the reformation of Islam and who's visiting Australia as a guest of the Centre for Independent Studies. Former French ambassador and co-founder of Doctors Without Borders, Jean-Christophe Rufin, and Middle East specialist Emma Skye, who served as an advisor to the US military in Iraq. Please welcome our panel. Thank you. Apologies, we had a few audio problems at the start of the program, but I guess you're hearing us now. And you can watch Q&A live across Australia on ABC TV and ABC News 24 and listen on News Radio. Let's go straight to our first question, which comes from Glenn Barnes.
Good evening. I grew up in a relatively simple world where the concept of being a good citizen was reasonably easy to comprehend, broadly understood, if not universally practiced. In today's complex world that's socially fragmented, have we lost sight of what it means to be a good citizen, individually or collectively, and therefore having a civil society versus one that might head towards chaos?
Julian Baggini, we'll start with you.
Well, it's a good question. I think what you said about the changing society is important, because I think being a good person and being a good citizen requires a combination of empathy, which is talked about a lot these days, but it needs understanding as well. And by the way, I've borrowed that line from the Coen brothers film Barton Fink, and I think they're some of the greatest philosophers working today. And I think it's that combination, because just having a sort of automatic sympathy doesn't always work. It often fails us, particularly when people are perhaps strangers. And understanding alone isn't enough, because you've got to have that fellow feeling. And I think the problem is, in a rapidly changing world, it's difficult to keep our understanding up to date. We're surrounded by people perhaps who come from cultures we don't understand, who have practices we don't understand. And so it's having that combination. And because it requires understanding, it means it's harder work than it used to be, I think.
Julian, just briefly, has the concept changed over time?
Well, I think in the fundamentals it hasn't. Being a good citizen is about acting in such a way that you're certainly looking after your own interests, but you're being pro-social as well. So the fundamental concept hasn't changed, but what it requires has changed enormously, because society has changed enormously and become much more complex.
Kate Tempest.
Well, I think it's kind of interesting that you said that you're from a generation where it was kind of universally practiced that people were good citizens. That makes me feel a bit strange, because I'm sure that isn't the case. But I think also this idea of we live under this kind of heavy mythology of the individual, of individualism above all else. And actually I think it's impossible to progress forwards being good citizens of the planet. We're moving towards a more kind of global understanding of who we are citizens of, you know. And actually, I think that as long as we kind of exist under this heavy, heavy false mythology of the individual at the expense of our communities, our societies, we've been severed from each other at the, for capital gain, you know, and all this kind of stuff. I think it's less to do with citizenship of nations, and it's more about waking up to the fact that we have been isolated from each other. I believe that we're all... You know what I mean? You might not like to hear this. I'm looking at your face, you're looking at me a bit funny, but I reckon that we're all part of each other's lives in a way that we cannot successfully isolate ourselves from each other without it being extremely damaging.
So, Kate, does your art reflect your concept of what it means to be a good person or a good citizen?
Well, it might do. I don't ask it to before I've made the work, but obviously the work that I create is going to carry everything that I'm going through at the time. It's interesting you say that about artwork and citizenship, because Plato, you know, to just bring it back a few thousand years, why not? He had this idea that, you know, why does a great piece of art elicit the response that it does from us? Why do you look at a great piece of art and why does it make you feel the way it does? And he said it's the beauty in a piece of art that connects with the beautiful virtues in you, it brings that to the fore, and that's why you have the response that you do. But if you're looking at artworks that reflect the kind of the darker side of civilization, the greed, you know, the fear, then that's going to elicit those feelings from you. But then the question is, I suppose, for artists, is like, if we're going through a time of barbarity, we're in a humanitarian crisis, I believe it's a difficult time, are we not to represent the truth of the times in case we make civilization worse? Is that, or do we try and ham it up and just make virtuous art to try and improve civilization? It's a difficult question.
Beautifully said, though, Kate. Thank you very much. Ayaan, what do you think? What does it take to be a good citizen? Do you strive to be one?
I strive to be one, but I think it used to be, and I agree with the gentleman who posed the question, that there was a time when it seemed easier, that, you know, you sort of took it for granted in liberal societies what it was to be a citizen, and I think it is civic education and what it took to make a citizen. And I think our society is challenged because that has been watered down. We expect people from different parts of the... Look at our society, not just Australia, the United States of America, all of these liberal societies are becoming more and more heterogeneous, new cultures, and yet the institutions that were in place to make citizens of them have been challenged and watered down, and I think there needs to be some kind of a common minimum moralia. What is it to be a good citizen, and empower these institutions to do what they were supposed to do, which is civic education.
Jean-Christophe Rufin?
I will answer as a European, I should say, and I think this question refers to the question of peace and war, because in the past, that's what you meant probably when you were speaking about the previous generation, the generation of my parents, my grandparents. Our countries were in war situations, and to be a good citizen was to be ready to pay your life to protect and to defend your values and your territory and your family, and that's all. And since the 60s, after the end of the colonial wars, and which the start of the prosperity in Europe and so on and so forth, it has become less clear because we have become less threatened by wars. There was the peace, and we emphasize more these global issues that Kate was talking about.
Well, Doctors Without Borders was more or less set up on the concept of what it means to be a good global citizen.
Exactly, but at that time, it was not referring to a nation, to a territory, but it was the idea that we were rich enough and in peace, and that we could help the world, you know, and have a kind of responsibility for the whole world. And came also the ecology and all these new things which go with globalization and so on and so forth, and which has changed, and that is my last word, which has changed and which confuses probably many people today, is the fact that we are not anymore at peace. We are again targeted by war actions. We have been, to speak for my country, last year severely and several times attacked with terrorist attacks on our ground. This has happened in other places in the United States much before, a long time before. And so we realized suddenly that we cannot only be the doctors of the world, but we have to come back to the issues of the survival of our own societies. And then it creates a kind of, you know, mental crisis for many of us.
We'll do that because we've got a lot of questions right on that point. Emma Skye, what do you think? What does it take to be a good citizen?
I think being a good citizen requires you to be an active participant in society, to serve others, to contribute to something bigger than yourself. And service can come in very different forms. I think of each of us every day, whenever you go out the house, you can interact with people. And that interaction can make people feel better about themselves or worse about themselves. But that sense of being part of something bigger than yourself, contributing, serving others, to me, that's the essence of good citizenry.
All right, more on that later. We'll come to our next question, slightly different subjects from Sierra Klasan.
So, in light of Germany's Jan Böhmermann's recent performance poem to the Turkish president, what role do you think art should be playing in contemporary society? Should there be limitations and/or legal responsibilities for artists, especially those producing satirical works?
Kate Tempest, will start with you there, since you're a performance poet. Makes sense. We should remind the audience, I guess, that this fellow Jan Böhmermann made a satirical poem, or broadcast a satirical poem about the Turkish president. And when I looked at some of the detail of it, it included allegations linking the Turkish president to bestiality, child pornography and other sexual perversions. So it was pretty out there.
Well, I think that to kind of pan out of that specific example and talk about, answer your question in a more kind of broad way, you're talking about, should there be limitations on art? Should satirical artists have legal obligations and responsibilities? Well, I personally think that no, not at all. I think that that would be a very dangerous place for an artist to be in if you had, you have an obligation and a responsibility at the point of conceiving a work, which is between you and the idea. You have to. It's got nothing to do with anybody in that moment, apart from the place that this idea comes from and trying to filter it through the mess of your humanity to get it out in the best way you possibly can. In the moment of performance of that idea, for the idea to live in any sense, there has to be a moment of communication and performance. And in that moment, when you are speaking to the people that it's for, then there is a responsibility that you have to those people, but it's a responsibility that you have as a part of your community, to the people that you're talking with and to, never to power. You know, it's very, very dangerous, I believe, if you are unable to critique or make light of or complain, or where does that end, you know? Because if you are an artist, you're tuned in at a certain frequency, and your duty is to feel for all those who are too busy, too blocked, or too otherwise engaged to be feeling. And not necessarily into that specific example, but I mean, I'm speaking to art in general. It is your obligation, your purpose, and not to sound too far-fetched about it, but your kind of whole calling in life is to feel and channel and get out any kind of thing that is happening, especially when it comes to, you know, those who are above you, you know, the power structures, I think.
Julian.
Well, I mean, various things here. I mean, I don't think artists are above the kind of rules around, say, incitement, which we're all subject to. So you can't just use the excuse of it's art if you're actually inciting violence and stuff. And I know that so rarely happens, you might think it's not worth saying.
Or racial hatred.
Well, inciting hatred, I'd say, yeah, is another problem. Now, the thing is, I think for reasons of protecting free speech, it's very important that the law takes minimal intervention here. But I think sometimes, you know, people criticise artists who behave in ways which are not remotely helpful for kind of community relations or for world harmony, for that matter. And they're accused of, like, trying to put a brake on free speech. I often find myself thinking, you have the perfect legal right to say what you said, but I think it was damned irresponsible and you shouldn't have done it. And you've got to be able to distinguish that sort of right to condemn and say people were wrong to do it with having a fairly generous legal conception which always has to err on the side of freedom over anything else.
Well, this guy, Berman, is a German TV star. He's being prosecuted under the German Criminal Code of 1871. So anyone who's guilty of an insult to a sovereign or regent of a state can be punished by prison.
Insult should never be punished by prison. I mean, that isn't the same as incitement to hatred or, you know, stirring up violence against people.
Ayaan Hirsi Ali.
Julian was just a bit vague, so I'm intrigued by, I mean, I'd love to hear an example of what you would punish as incitement.
Well, I think if someone was to, for example, hold a rally, which is a far-right rally, and there was to get someone up at that rally who is, like, say, a poet or a comedian, and they use their art to sort of encourage the crowd to go out and beat up people from a minority, for example, that would be incitement. And you know, the fact that it was art or poetry wouldn't let them off the hook. Now, I don't think that I've never heard of that happening, right? Yeah. But I think it's important to recognise that you couldn't just use art as an excuse in that situation. It would still be incitement in the same way that if someone who stood up who wasn't a poet and incited violence, we'd have to say that was illegal.
And what about this case? Turkish President Erdogan, you've had a bit to say about him in the past. Yeah. He's actually prosecuted 2,000 people in Turkey over the past 3 years for insulting the president.
And that is tyranny. Here is a man who has concentrated power. He's elected, at least he's come to power through elections. And now that he is in power, every individual within Turkish society who deems to criticize him is accused of insulting him or the state of Turkey or some other infraction, and they're imprisoned. And I think for the context of the German satirist is he was doing his job. I think satire is extremely important in liberal society. It is what stands between us and violence. And I think that the Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, should have explained it to Mr. Erdogan that this is an internal affair, and he had.
It's pretty hard to explain if you saw the poem. It's pretty insulting, sexually explicit, and even referring to the size of his genitals. I mean, it goes on and on and on.
Why is it so
He's a comedian, for goodness sake. He's a satirist, and if you start to care as the head of a state of a country like Turkey, 80 million people, and you start to care about that sort of thing, it just shows how insecure that man is, how tyrannical he is, and the fact that because he's shut down all sorts of internal criticism within Turkey, wants to become a member of the EU, that even European citizens who at least are used to some form of freedom of expression cannot criticize him. I think it is deplorable, it is appalling. This man should be released and Mr. Erdogan should be put in his place.
Jean-Christophe. Thank you. What do you think about this? I mean, Germany's in a difficult position here because it's trying to get Turkey to help stop refugees coming into Europe, and now you have a German satirist basically saying all sorts of terrible things about the president.
Big part of the problem. I just start with a little story. A few days ago, I was in a TV show in France, and in the green room behind, when I arrived, another panelist arrived. He's a humorist designer, very famous, and he was wearing a coat like this. I shook his hand, and he said, "I'll change my clothes." I said, "Why?" And he took off the coat, and underneath he was wearing a jacket-proof, bulletproof jacket, which means that in my country today, the humorists are wearing bulletproof jackets. So this is, of course, the direct result of the terrorist attack against Charlie Hebdo, the newspaper, which occurred in past January last year. So this has created a big debate. Of course, France is the country of the human rights, and I perfectly agree. I completely agree with Ayaan on this topic. I mean, there's absolutely no possibility to excuse the fact, to condemn, to put in jail someone who just expressed his freedom of expression. But on the other hand, and this is all the problems we have, the reality of the political state. We cannot manage this crisis of migrants. We cannot handle it because Europe as a space has created a space, the Schengen space, delegating the control of its border to Turkey and Greece. And of course, after having received 1 million of refugees, Madame Merkel is in the hands completely of Erdogan, first of all. But second, there is a second point, and I think we won't agree on this. It's the fact that in a country like mine, today you cannot insult, for instance, certain categories of people. You couldn't say something against homosexuals, against, the Jews, maybe against. And so that creates a problem in the sense that the Muslim consider, are they right or wrong, I don't know, but consider that's the only persons that you can insult, it's the Muslims. So there is the problem in principle of Erdogan and the others, but there is also the feeling of people who are seeking a certain kind of respect. And that's why I'm divided in this, because liberty of freedom of expression, yes, but can you and should you use this expression to insult a community?
Well, let's go back to, you said you might not, you and Ayaan might not agree on this. I'll just go back quickly to find out whether there is disagreement on this point.
I think we should move away from the term insult. And if you, let's just take the Muslim community in France or in any other part of Europe. If I want to address, the jihadists, and I want to talk about jihad, if I want to talk about Islamic law, I think that Islamic law is deplorable. Is it an insult to Muslims if I say Islamic law is deplorable, Sharia law? Sharia law degrades women. It degrades homosexuals. It is a message of intolerance. Am I insulting to the Muslim if I say that, or am I engaging the Muslim in a conversation about what these things mean in practice? If you believe that homosexuals should be put to death for homosexuality, or apostates should be put to death for homosexuality, we talk about that. Is that offensive to Muslims? It is not. So I think we should totally and completely move away from, when discussing beliefs and doctrines and traditions versus human beings, we should move away from such terminology as insults. I do not insult Muslims by questioning Islamic law. I honor them with reason.
Emma, let me bring you in and make a... Thanks, Ayaan. We could make the point about President Erdogan and satire, because this is the man who said you cannot bring men and women into equal positions. It's against nature. And he said it at a women's conference in Istanbul.
Look, I mean, no one's going to be on this panel defending Erdogan. And when you look at, in the early days when Erdogan first came to power, there was hope that this was going to be a demonstration of moderate Islam rule, moderate Islamist rule. That hasn't materialized. I mean, Erdogan himself is taking more and more power. He is undermining, he's trying to change the constitution. He's undermining the democratic institutions of Turkey. So Erdogan himself is a dangerous person. He's not setting a good model as a leader. He's not setting a good model for the region. But the question was about freedom of speech. And freedom of speech is paramount. Freedom of speech is critical. But then that doesn't include the freedom to incite violence. Because when you allow hate speech, that leads to people being killed. And we have seen that. If you say something against a leader of a country, make an insult against Erdogan, that's not incitement to kill Erdogan. He is president. He has got the power of the state. That's very different from picking on a minority group, whether it's homosexuals or Jews, and stirring up people to hate them. So there is a difference in that.
OK, well, if you have a live Twitter question, by the way, for us, remember to keep it short and add a question mark so we can find it. Now, our next question comes from Rohan Venkatraman.
Good day, Ayaan. In your book, Heretic, you categorise the followers of Islam as extremists, dissidents, and the peaceful and observant majority. Each time there's an act by the extremists of violence or misogyny, there's often a debate surrounding the majority, calling them out to act and referring them as guilty by silence. Do you think this is fair to call upon the peaceful majority to condemn these acts? And if so, what steps can be taken to curb such future acts of violence?
Ayaan.
I think that you have to see and appreciate diversity among Muslims as individuals, spread over several continents who speak different languages, different ages, different socioeconomic backgrounds, and different degrees in what they take and how much of Islam as a doctrine they observe. I think that if you say, and I try to address this in Heretic, if you say that as a Muslim, I object to some of the conduct of the Prophet Muhammad, then I categorize you as a modifier, because you're trying to say there is a discrepancy between what I believe in as a Muslim and what Muhammad orders me to do, or what is in the Quran, and I'd like to change that. That's the modifying Muslim. I'm on their side. The Medina Muslims, the individuals who are engaged, they're organizing, they can be heads of state like Erdogan, they can be movements like the Muslim Brotherhood or Hizb ut-Tahrir, I think you are more familiar with that movement here in Australia, or they can just be individuals. I think those individuals should be engaged, and it is not a blanket condemnation of all Muslims to say, we need to address such doctrines as jihad, as commanding right and forbidding wrong, as Sharia law, as this call to sacrifice your life for the hereafter when you don't really know if there is a hereafter, and obeying, the one man, one book slogan. So to have this kind of conversations and debates with Muslims is to see them as equals, to see them as individuals endowed with reason. And it's the same kind of critical conversation you would have with Christians, with Jews, with Buddhists, with Marxists a while back, and with, in Nazi Germany and afterwards, with white supremacists who believe in National Socialism. Do not exempt Muslims from that kind of critical dialogue. Do not subject them to the bigotry of low expectations.
And before we move on, just give us a quick appraisal of what a reformation of Islam would look like. Would it require the overthrow of fundamentalist clerics in Iran and Saudi Arabia and other places?
It would require that, but I think what I believe in is, and here's why we keep going back to the freedom of expression, is the most effective way of overthrowing such power structures is through the freedom of speech. The one thing that these clerics fear and hate, it's that critical thinking and that critical discussion, and so they shut that down. Take a look at the Saudi young man who is blogging away and is questioning the power of the clergymen. They lock him up, they flog him, they are going to obviously kill him because they've accused him of apostasy. That is how much they hate critical thinking and the freedom of speech. You want to overthrow these people, you don't need to use violence. You need to question over and over again their logic, and their logic doesn't hold up to daylight.
Let me quickly go back to our questioner, Rohan, listening to this. Did that answer your question, or do you have a further...
So my question surrounds more around, every time an act of violence is committed by the extremists, is it fair to look upon the peaceful mob among the followers of Islam and question them as to why they don't condemn it? That was more of my question. Is it fair to look upon your neighbour who might be a Muslim and go, do you condemn this act of extremism committed in the US or in Great Britain or Paris?
I think it's not about being fair or unfair. I think we live in a world where people who identify themselves as Muslims invoke the Quran and invoke the Prophet Muhammad, and they go around killing people shouting Allahu Akbar. And I think it is perfectly justified for those of us who don't do that to ask fellow Muslims, just pose the question, what on earth is this about? That is not Islamophobia, that is not unfair. If you share the philosophy, the religion, the background, the tradition, and that is posed, it is making an appeal on your citizenship, on your obligation to this community. And I don't think you should be offended by that. If you are, I think in this environment, it is okay to say, I'm not going to take part in this debate.
Let's hear from other members of the panel on this very question. Jean-Christophe.
Well, I go back to this question of insulting and criticizing, because I think there is a limit between the two. Criticizing even the base and the principles of the religion is a right. It is a perfect and total right. Criticize the church, criticize the Quran, criticize any religion, and even deeply, and even pretend that you don't believe in God. This is a right, a human right, fundamental. But I persist to say that in societies like ours, especially, for instance, mine in France, where we have almost 10 million of 1/5 of the population which is Muslim, insulting is useless. Insulting is dangerous. And I'm not talking about insulting Erdogan or someone else, but throwing pigs in front of a mosque, like the extreme right does sometimes, it is absolutely stupid. And this requires a kind of, moral limit, but it depends on us. It's difficult to put that in the law. Not to insult these people, because I think that part of these people, these young people, the youngsters brought up in our suburbs and who go to Syria and who come back pretending that they are fighting for God, but generally speaking, they have never opened a Quran. But they just, why they are going back to their religion or pretend to? Because probably something has not got right in their way to be adapted to this society, and insulting them, I repeat, is dangerous.
You're not saying it's insulting to call for a reformation of the religion that they're part
Not
of?
at all, not
Okay.
at all. I'm not speaking about that. I'm speaking about insults. I mean,
all right.
you know, it happens every day. I mean, these acts of... and, of course, the more the situation is tense, the more people, some people, you know, extreme people, violent people, can be attracted to act. And I think it's the same. The question that asked this gentleman is related to that. I mean, why do you ask us to defend, to criticize something that we are not responsible of?
Okay, Jean-Christophe, I'm going to interrupt you because we've got a few more questions on this subject. We'll go to the next one right now. We'll hear from the other panellists. From Ned Gilson.
Hi, thanks very much. Ayaan, it's no exaggeration to say that you are a hero for feminists and free thinkers across the globe. But as a consequence of you breaking a taboo and criticising the doctrines of Islam, you've been condemned by many liberals. Are you at all sanguine about how liberals and progressives are approaching Islamic theocracy? Or do you feel that what Maajid Nawaz calls regressive liberalism is too pervasive?
I will start with you, Ayaan, but we do want to hear from the other panellists.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Maajid Nawaz is a British thinker. He's now become definitely a very good friend of mine. And he does address what the left does, which is to lump people together as Muslims and as various other groups and subject them to what we both call the bigotry of low expectations. It is perfectly fine to question any other religion and to criticize any other religion. Excuse me.
Bless you, even if you're an atheist.
Thank you. But it's become increasingly difficult, and what we have done to Muslims in the West is that we only see them through this prism of victims and victimization. And these Medina Muslims, these individuals who want to indoctrinate them, they do present them as victims because they want to isolate them from the rest of society. So yes, I do think that it's not only important to address the extremists, the Medina Muslims, and their agenda, but how the left contributes to that agenda.
Let's go across the panel. Julian, do you sort of see this, that the left has somehow allied itself in a weird way to the extreme right on this issue?
I think there's something to that criticism, and I think Ayaan's right that there's a certain oversensitivity, this idea that, you know, it's a superior virtue of the oppressed. You know, the Muslim peoples of the world are put in that category of the oppressed, and that means that, you know, you can't say anything critical of them. I think there's some of that. I don't think it's the whole story. I think there are good reasons why people like myself, you know, white male Westerners, are rightly queasy about going in and aggressively criticising people from other cultures. You know, I've been travelling a bit this year, and I go to places like, you know, India, and you speak to Islamic philosophers, and, you know, a huge number of them just say they're sick of being told how to live by you sort of white Western imperialisms. We have that imperialist history. So I think some of the kind of reluctance of liberals to be too vocal about this is a quite appropriate understanding that if we've made a huge mistake in the past, it's that we've been too quick to assume that our morality is superior, we're going to impose it on people, and we kind of are trying to give a bit more space for the liberal reform to happen within, and perhaps giving quieter support to it. Now, I understand why some people want more vocal support from us and are a bit frustrated by it, but I also completely understand why, you know, we have good reasons perhaps for not wading in too heavy-handedly.
So let me just ask you this. We've got Ayaan here, and she was talking about Maajid Nawaz, of course, in London, who you probably know as well. I mean, are you saying it's OK for people from within the religion to be critical but not for those outside?
I don't think it's an either-or. I think it's easier and better for people from within to be the loudest critics, and I think the further you are from the centre of it, the more you should keep your criticism perhaps to the fringes, because there's also the problem of unholy alliances there as well, you know, because, you know, unfortunately, I don't blame Ayaan for this, but a lot of the people who jump on her words are using it for a very conservative sort of agenda which is quite unsavoury. So, you know, they're always going to be people who are far from the centre who are just going to, you know, use these words to further their own nefarious ends sometimes.
Kate, what do you think?
Oh, I don't know if I've got anything that valuable to contribute to this discussion, really. I'd like to be honest. I think that there are kind of radical acts of violence perpetrated by other groups, particularly my government, and it's a very difficult thing to kind of separate these acts of terror into these camps, because I think that actually there is so much disastrous terror being inflicted globally. We are in a state of war right now. It just so happens that I can happily travel safely to the other side of the world to participate in a fucking panel show, which just goes to show the barbarity of the inequalities that we live under. I think that what maybe is important for me to say is that, as I understand religion, it is the love of God, right? So whether you understand God as being God, you know, the universe, nature, creativity, whatever it is that if you have this feeling, this love of what Jung would have called the spirit of the depths, the idea of violence is so abhorrent and so far away from this love that you have for God, you know. Not that I'm a religious person, but I understand that sentiment.
But you grew up in South London, of course, as you would say, a number of young Muslim men who got radicalised in the community you came from.
Well, I don't know about that. Like, there's a big Muslim community in London, yes, and actually, I don't agree that they're thought of as victims. It's a strong presence. If you grow up in a place where there's not much cohesion, I was talking earlier about the kind of this myth of the individual, the lack of anything to kind of stand for. You were talking about being a good citizen means being a part of something bigger than yourself. If there is all this fracturing and also you're kind of constantly faced with this oppression of your own path in life, then I think the idea of belonging to something which offers you routine, peace, a kind of relationship with a higher purpose and your own soul, that's quite an attractive prospect, I think, for a lot of people. And I think that it's just muddy water, because I don't understand any act of violence to be anything to do with religion. I think these are different things.
All right. Sorry to interrupt you there, Kate. We've got a video question. It's on this subject again, and we'll hear from the rest of the panellists after this one. It's from Susie Latham in Preston, Victoria.
Ayaan, you say you're a women's rights advocate, yet you deny Muslim women agency and receive almost no support from them. Your support in Western countries has come from right-wing conservatives that benefit from you speaking when, as you have said, they would have been labelled racists. Why do you make life more difficult for Muslim women in Western countries by calling them slaves and submissive robots, and for women in Muslim countries by advocating military strikes on places like Iraq and Iran?
Let's go to this side of the panel, and Ayaan, we'll start with you, obviously. It's directed to you.
Well, I do have Muslim women as my friends and as my supporters. I have started a foundation in the United States of America, and we welcome women, young women, young girls, women of middle age, and here's what they complain about. Here's what they come to us for. They're subjected to forced marriages. They're running away from a forced marriage, and their children are taken away from them. They have no custody. They are subjected to women who see their own children being forced into marriage. They're subjected to female genital mutilation. They're enslaved. They're forced to wear the veil when they don't want to wear the veil. This is what is happening to Muslim women. And when you said that at times you feel squeamish about, being a white man and in that culture, here's what I wish that white men and white women would not feel squeamish about. It is to protect the rights of the individuals within these communities and within these groups. If you have young girls who are subjected to forced marriage, it is not a marriage, it's an arranged rape, it's a forced rape, and I wish we were not squeamish about it. We were not squeamish about slavery, we were not squeamish about eradicating civil rights, apartheid, and I wish that that is one thing we would not be squeamish about.
Emma, let's bring you in. There are a few questions sort of cascading. We haven't heard from you on any of them, so maybe you'd like to pick up on some of the threads there. I mean, do you feel squeamish at all as a white Western woman thinking or talking about this subject?
Well, a quarter of the world's population are Muslims. 1.6 billion people are Muslim. There is huge diversity within that group. You meet many Muslims who get great joy and meaning from their practice of Islam. You'll hear many criticise the Islamic State and say that is not what Islam is about. For most Muslims in the world, they do not see the Islamic State as Muslim. That's why the Islamic State doesn't have millions and millions of followers. The vast majority of Muslims in the world do not adhere to that, do not agree to that. Now, of course, there are many, many different issues that Ayaan has highlighted. And the question for me is, what is the best way to address those? If it's extremism within Islam, then the best people to address that are Muslims. What can I and others who are non-Muslim do to help empower those Muslims to address it and not make all Muslims feel that their faith, their way of life is under threat? Because that just makes things worse. So I think much more about how to address these issues. What is the most effective way of addressing these issues?
And do you think, again, as a white Western woman, that if you were to call for reformation of Islam, it wouldn't be right coming from your lips?
It is not my religion. Do I look at Ted Cruz or Trump and think those are representatives of Christianity? Do we want to hear people of other faiths condemning Christianity because of the way that those people behave? Yes, there's lots that needs to happen within Islam. And I talk to many Muslim friends about that. But I don't feel, as a Western non-Muslim, that my role is to stand up and to criticize aspects of their religion. I will criticize violence. I will criticize the horrible terrorist attacks that took place in France. Those are awful. But I will not say that is Islam.
Jean-Christophe, a brief answer here, if you don't mind.
Yeah, brief. There is a big change, you know, recently in the strategy of this extremist group, and this maybe serves the interest of what we defend altogether, in the sense that now, you know, Al-Qaeda was targeting Christians or white people, you know, so non-Muslim and non-origin of the third world. But the new terrorist attack that we have supported were undiscriminated. And there were many Muslims among the victims. And this has completely changed the way the Muslim community in France sees these attacks. I mean, it touches also their lives, you know. And in that sense, we have to preserve this unity that has, you know, started to exist after this.
Can I come back in here? Because I think when you look at what's happened in London recently, with the election of Sadiq Khan as Mayor of London, 1.3 million people voted for Sadiq Khan. And I think it's an extraordinary event that has taken place. So they voted for him not based on identity politics, not based on the way he's a practicing Muslim, but not based on his faith or anything like that. They voted for him because he was seen as having the best agenda to address the needs of London. And I think he, if you like, personifies that there is not an inherent clash of civilizations. The people from all different faiths and backgrounds can live together. And so I'm proud to be a Londoner after that election.
I'm just going to give the last word on this question to Ayaan, briefly again, because we've got a few other questions to get to.
Oh, goodness me. Where do I begin? Well, first, I think the Sadiq Khan, the election, I mean, let it be on the record that that is a best-case scenario. I wish you are right. But he's also elected because of the organized Islamists who have an agenda. And let's see if I am right. If he doesn't give them what they want, what the retaliation will be. And if he gives them what they want, we will see what that means, especially for women and children. Now, that...
Well, your friend Majid Nawaz disagrees with that, by the way. Majid says that, that Khan is not connected to those groups at all.
No, he doesn't say that. He says Majid Nawaz is not an Islamist, but he is most definitely elected because he depended too heavily on the organized Islamists. That's what Majid says. And if that is the case, if Majid is right, then we shall see what scenario comes. I mean, I really wish that you are right. Absolutely, Emma. I hope you are right. Now, on the one about what you say, if you are a white woman or a white man, what you can and cannot say. Let's go back to that first question, which was, as citizens of the same nation state, if we share or purport to share the same destiny, then I don't think that you can hold on to the logic that only Muslims can criticize Islam, only Christians can criticize Christianity, and so on. We don't want a parallel society existing or consisting of all these fragmented communities, but we're all individuals. And I think if, in the name of Islam, liberal institutions and liberal rights are being threatened, then it is everyone's obligation, not just Muslims, to criticize that.
OK, remember, if you hear any doubtful claims... Thank you. Sorry about that. If you hear any doubtful claims on Q&A, even the one that I just made about Majid Nawaz, which was refuted, send a tweet using the hashtags FactCheck and Quanda. Keep an eye on our Twitter account for the verdicts from ABC Fact Check Unit and the Conversations academics. Our next question comes from Zareen Joy.
Hi. If humans are just the puppets of outside forces, and if the results of an election are already predetermined, then is it fit to assume that free will is given just as an illusion to the voters?
Julian, it's a big, big leap from your sort of free will notions to whether it will actually dictate elections. But have a crack at it.
Well, there are a couple of big ifs there, I think. And it's really difficult to untangle this. I mean, how much time have we got? Not long enough, unfortunately. Look, I think that this issue of free will is a complicated one, and people are rather confused by it. A lot of philosophers are confused by it too, so that's not surprising. But I think the real issue here is that we hear a lot about how human beings are kind of just biological machines and just biological robots, and that our behaviour is being determined merely by the operations of our brains. Now, the problem with those statements is that they're almost entirely true if you take out the justs and the merelys, right? Then it's suddenly not so scary. Because I don't know about you, but I'm pretty confident that I am indeed a biological machine, if that's what an animal is, right? And I'm also pretty sure that what is driving my thought, the hardware, as it were, underlying the software of the brain, of our mind, is the brain. So I'm quite comfortable with the idea that, yes, I'm a fully part of nature, and in a way I'm operating under nature's laws. But does that mean I have no free will? Well, only if you think free will is some kind of magic which enables us to stand outside of nature and create our own identities from scratch. Who thinks that? We all know we take after our parents, for better or for worse, and so forth. So I think we just have a more modest idea of what free will is. And it relates to the political, actually. You're free to the extent that your choices are genuinely yours, that they're not being coerced upon you, that you've had the opportunity to reflect upon them and think about them. Now, if underlying all of that is biological machinery, I'm quite relaxed about that.
Now, you're in the David Hume tradition. Your arguments about free will are, but David Hume didn't know about genes. I mean, they didn't. The science had not progressed far enough for him to understand what genes mean. What do you say to the scientists who say it's genes that dictate the way we behave and our free will?
Well, the science of genes and also the science of brain science is only adding detail to what people like Hume thought all along. Look, no matter what you know about the processes that underlie it, everything we do can only be a consequence of a combination of two things, nature and nurture. Exactly what the balance is, who knows? But what other thing could it be? What would it mean for you to make a choice which had nothing to do with nature or nurture? That would be to make a choice that came from nowhere. That wouldn't be valuable free will. That would be just kind of a random decision generator, right? So before we got all this scary neuroscience and genetics, we knew we were products of nature and nurture. And
neuroscientists in and of themselves, because of what they think, scary.
Oh, what, sorry?
Neuroscientists scary because a lot of them do hold this view that free will doesn't exist.
Well, people are scared, but I don't know why. Because, as I say, for all the time there's been human beings, people have said, oh, look, he's just like his mother, just like his father, right? But when people say, you're doing that because of your genes, it's suddenly scary. But it's exactly the same thought in scientific terms, isn't it?
Kate Tempest, do you believe that you act purely on free will? Or something secretly buried in your system dictate the way you think and act?
Well, I think that it's really interesting what you say. have this kind of obsession with cycles, with these behavioural patterns that we fall into in our own lives, you know. So if I act completely of my own free will, how come I'm repeating this damaging behaviour once again that I thought I'd escaped? How come I'm back here, you know? And actually,
There's a lot of people out there asking themselves the same question.
Right. And it's until you've kind of learned, and there's all these things you have to go through to recognise the behaviour in order to change it. But as for the kind of individual, so for everybody, as I keep banging on about, so we are also, as societies, as a race, we are finding ourselves going around and around in these damaging situations. Civilizations rise and we inevitably destroy ourselves and each other, and then it kind of starts again. But at what point can we become cognizant of that pattern, break it, change it? Is that free will or is that enlightenment? I don't know what that is, you know what I mean? So I don't really... I kind of think I agree with you, but I keep finding that there are these cycles that go around, and it's kind of the beauty of life to catch it before it catches you, you know, I suppose.
Well said. Ayaan, do you believe you act entirely from free will, or do other things cause you to act in the way you do?
I think it is exactly as you say, it is a combination of nature and nurture, and I think to be human is to at least have the ability or the illusion that we have choices and to act on them and to understand the consequences of our choices, isn't it? That is, you know, freedom is to be free is to be responsible.
Doesn't sound like you're entirely sure it's not an illusion.
Well, I mean, Kate described how we keep on falling into these traps that we create for ourselves. But yeah, it is true. It is nature.
You just go from panel to panel to panel.
Yeah. Well, I say I'm going to stop travelling now, and I find myself travelling again, and so on. But it is
Monday. It must be Sydney.
Most definitely nature. Yeah.
Jean-Christophe.
I always had bad marks in philosophy at school, so I don't...
Nicely said. Emma.
I believe in free will. I do. Although sometimes when things go so badly wrong and you're trying to sort of say it's nothing to do with me, you like to feel it was preordained, there was nothing you could do. But I'm with free will.
Yeah, I'll just quickly throw back to Julian here, since you're the expert on this subject. I mean, don't humans inevitably meet forks in the road of their lives where free will dictates which way they go?
Well, it depends what you mean by free will. I'm afraid that's a boring philosopher's answer. But
well, you are a boring philosopher.
I am a boring philosopher. Well said. But, you know, I think the important thing is that if you think of free will as some absolute capacity to leap free of your conditioning and your experience and make a choice in a vacuum, that's not what happens at the fork in the road. You see, I think free will is something you can have more or less of. It's that the more you are able to reflect on what you do, to make the decisions for yourself rather than to be coerced by others, the freer it is. And so what happens at a fork in a road is there's a sense in which at that particular moment, given your life experience to date, it is inevitable you're going to go one way or another. But the point is, that point of inevitability has been reached as part of kind of your own story. So, you know, some people say that can't be free will, but I think the alternative is just some kind of magical fantasy of just being able to escape the normal run of the universe and create ourselves from nothing.
Anyway, a tree did fall down in the woods. You are not a boring philosopher. And we're going to move on to our last question. We've got time for one more. It's from Craig Bailey.
Sanctions provided an effective method in helping bring an end to apartheid in South Africa. What can be done to stop otherwise liberal nations from trading with the likes of Saudi Arabia?
Ayaan, obviously right down your alley there. Should there be sanctions against Saudi Arabia?
Free will. I think if liberal societies could mobilise citizens and mobilise their governments to treat Saudi Arabia the way we treated South Africa, and bring them to their knees and make them see that the segregation that they practice of men and women and the degrading of people who are not Wahhabis, I mean everyone who is not a Wahhabi in that society is degraded to something lower, if not entirely killed or imprisoned or in some other way tortured. So if that dark continent, that dark kingdom is recognized for what it is, and if it were to be confronted with the same sanctions as South Africa, I think it would not only improve Saudi society, it would probably improve the entire Muslim world.
Now,
we'll have to find oil somewhere.
I was going to say, one of the big differences, South Africa did not have massive deposits of oil. I mean, this is the problem, isn't it? I mean, you can't really do much against the kingdom without threatening your own economies.
So the good news is, again, I want to go back to that whole free will thing. The good news is that we now have a determined movement, a determined global movement that is looking into alternative sources of energy and into alternative sources of oil, so that we are not entirely dependent on this dark kingdom.
Jean-Christophe, bearing in mind you were once an ambassador, let's bring your sort of diplomatic hat here to the table.
I won't use a diplomatic speech. I will tell things frankly, and the role and the weight of Saudi Arabia and others, and I'm thinking to Qatar, for instance, who owns the great football club Paris Saint-Germain now. It's terrible, you know, because this club has become a champion since it is owned by Qatar. We are very proud of our club, but I'm not very proud that we do that to Qatar, which has a double language, which is a country, because there's not only Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is well identified, but there are others who are even more dangerous for that. And I completely believe that not referring to the mind of these, the brain of these young boys and girls who go to Syria to combat and all, there is a role, a fundamental role done by the propaganda financed by these states in our countries, which puts in their mind that they are victims, that there is a global coalition against Islam, and so on and so forth. And so I think our dependence, which is huge economically to this country, is really very serious, and it's a terrible issue.
Could sanctions ever work in the way they did eventually against South Africa?
Well, I won't speak about sanctions because it's less, you know, it's more cutting our dependence on them. We have never been dependent on South Africa, and we had to put sanctions because to pressure them. But this is not the case. We are dependent on them, and we have to release this dependence at first before we can do something with them. We must, as Ayaan said, find other sources of energy and completely change our mind on this problem of because it's a soft drug, you know. It's a soft drug. We buy oil to them, and we are completely in their hands.
Emma, what do you think?
Well, there's a lot of problems with a lot of regimes in the Middle East. And these regimes seem incapable to cope with their ever-growing young population. They're unable to provide them with jobs. They have real challenges ahead. We've seen in a number of places what happens when the state collapses. And that's led to civil wars and, you know, terrorist groups thriving.
Or what happens when America, for example, invades them and the country becomes destroyed for another reason.
Yeah. So you can look at all of those things.
Well, I can't agree with that.
You think, these regimes in the Middle East, how can we help set incentives to make these regimes better regimes to serve their people? Sanctions is an extremely problematic tool. You saw what happened in Iraq with the use of sanctions in the 90s. That led to the collapse of the middle class, 500,000 children dying of malnutrition, and the regime maintained control over the whole state. So I don't think sanctions is the tool to go. How do we help set those incentives that promote more education, help diversify the economy, and get us away from this relationship that we had of selling weapons and buying oil?
Ayaan, you did want to jump in there. I think you wanted to take me to task.
About blaming America and American wars and American invasions. I mean, I don't think America just stood up one day and decided to go into Afghanistan and Iraq. There was a reason for that. And
what was the reason for going into Iraq, for example? Because they said it was for weapons of mass destruction. And in the Bush's office, immediately after September 11, it was plotted that this would be the next course of action, even though there was nothing there.
The jury is still out on whether there were weapons of mass destruction or not at that point. I remember I was in Parliament and we were reviewing, should we now go with the coalition of the willing, this is the Netherlands, or not go with the coalition of the willing? And based on the information we had at that point, we decided to go with the coalition of the willing. does America make major policy mistakes? Yes. And has that exacerbated the problem in the Middle East? Yes. But it's not the cause, and it's not entirely the cause, because look at President Obama's policies. When he pulled out, first out of Iraq and is slowly pulling out of Afghanistan, has that improved anything?
No, I think you can say that 2 presidents made fatal misjudgments. And I'll move on to quickly hear from our other panellists.
Before that. I just want to say one thing quickly. It's interesting we're talking about these kind of diabolical regimes, but there is an equally diabolical regime in power, which is the kind of neoliberal regime of capitalism, which is controlling, which is oppressing its people. You talk about these terrible regimes where young people can't work. Well, that's Britain. I mean, there is all kinds of this whole society, this whole web of the acceptable diabolical regime, which is swallowing the globe. It's eating up resources. It's making people ill with anxieties, and there is an awful kind of interplay here between what we think of as an acceptable evil and a kind of non-acceptable evil. The core of all of this is greed, and it is unacceptable in this day and age. Wait, no, because what I'm saying about circles, etc., the minute we become cognizant of this, it should be enough for us. We can spot barbarity in other cultures, we can spot it in our past, but when it's in our midst, we find it much harder to accept it and own up to it. We are in the middle of a barbarous time, and it's greed that is at the root of it. And I don't disagree that it's terrible, Saudi Arabia, talking about the Dark Kingdom, but I also think what's terrible is the Western kind of dominant global capital, what's happening in this country in Australia, what's happening in my country in Britain. I've just been in America doing this book tour. I've just seen it for myself. The divides between people. It's unforgivable in these times, and it's time that actually all this is actually nonsense. This is actually nonsense because there is something bigger at stake, and it's happening to everybody right now, you know? Sorry.
That's okay. Julian, I'll give you the last word.
Well, at the risk of contributing to all this nonsense, I mean, this question gives me a chance to cover Ayaan, because the point is, Ayaan said earlier I was squeamish, and I didn't use that word, I don't think. I apologise if I did. My concern is not with being squeamish, but it is about making sure that whatever is done is effective, and that's what makes me concerned about any kind of, outside intervention. Sanctions, would they be effective? I think the other panellists have explained why possibly that's not the right instrument. But I do agree that, unfortunately, and this is where I think I'm sure Kate does agree with this, that too often countries like my own have been not just willing to trade with Saudi Arabia, but trade on, just any terms almost, without asking any questions, without doing anything it could to try and sort of use any leverage and try and improve conditions there. So, I think you always have to use the right tool for the right job, as Emma said. But you can't be overly idealistic, unfortunately, in global politics. In global politics, you've got to have values at your core, absolutely. But you've got to make sure that what you do is genuinely effective. Otherwise, you risk being counterproductive, as sanctions were in Iraq under Saddam Hussein.
OK, I'm sorry that's all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel, Julian Baggini, Kate Tempest, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, Jean-Christophe Rufin and Emma Skye. OK, that's your cue. Thank you very much. Our thanks to the Sydney Writers' Festival and the Centre for Independent Studies. Now, next Monday, we're back on the election trail with the Manager of Government Business and Minister for Industry, Innovation and Science, Christopher Pyne, in a Q&A debate with the Shadow Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Cities, Anthony Albanese. As the election clock ticks down, 2 of Australia's most popular and most powerful politicians go head-to-head to answer your questions. And we'll leave you tonight with Kate Tempest performing Progress, her poem about the world after religion. Now, if strong language offends, you might want to take a cup of tea right now. Until next Monday, good night.
Once there was a purpose, so I hear there was a God. It made it all less worthless, and it gave us the because we'd all been searching for. Unarguable truth. A reason to be kind and just. A reason for the noose that sent the sinner off to sinner land and made us all feel better in the knowledge that the righteous would be right and just forever. Once there was religion and it ruled and we all had it bad. We fooled ourselves to sleep at night, said this was this and that was that. And if our morals ever shook, we looked no further than the book. But gradually we we felt the pressure, it became the great oppressor. And without God, the wars seemed crueler, life seemed stranger, art seemed foolish, death seemed bleaker now than ever. What was mankind for? What terror flooded us to understand? There was no point, no grander plan, there was just living out each day. Work, eat, sleep, fuck, pass away. Now without the fear of retribution, we found guilt-free pleasure, but we lost the sense of union that had kept us all together, and we needed something new to fill the emptiness that grew. And what's better to believe in than all-you-can-eat freedom? The dream of being who you are by virtue of the things you buy. The joy of getting rich enough to live outside the common life. And now there is no virtue that exists beyond our greed. Now there is the worship of experience and need, and we run around these circuits, pit our grace against our greed, and all we have is surplus to what's needed, and we feed our callous little urchins in the best ways that we can, and then we wonder how they've grown to only know what's in their hands. Because now we have the screen, and it rules, and our kids are plugged into its promise, and they're admiring all its jewels, and our couples eat their dinner in the glimmer of its rays, and we stare until we've learned the world's ways. Pre-teens learn what heartthrobs are. Heartthrobs gorge on hot pork and watch sport. Morality showed for us to sneer and weep at. Here's our morality at last, see us caught in full colour, high definition. Look, a cripple on a blind date. Look, young people getting fucked in Magaluf. Look, the mother of a dead son weeping irate. Look, a celebrity eating shit and singing agadoo. They used to burn women who had epileptic fits. They would tie you to a stake and they'd proclaim you a witch. Now they'll put you on the screen if you've got nice tits, but you will be torn apart if you let yourself slip. And they'll draw red rings around your saggy bits, and they'll flick through the pictures while they eat bags of chips, because you can either be a beauty or a beast or a bitch. You could either be kooky or cool or kitsch. Look, before you were damned for the things that you did, or if you didn't live how the villagers lived, but now you're handed the mould and told fit into this. And maybe one day you could really be big. Behind the scenes footage of the famous last gig, the backstage close-up of the singer's last twitch, before she pulls a gun out and she blows herself to bits. Yes, the world is your playground. Go and get your kicks. As long as you're not poor or ugly or sick. We never saw it coming, just like all the best tricks. Because yes, once we had the fear, but now we have the fix.